Hey guys, Alton here from Microgrinder Poker School, and for today's video we have a selected video from our MTT 101 course that's created by George Mathis, our resident MTT pro. So hope you guys enjoy the video. This course is a comprehensive beginner's guide to microstakes online MTTs. So let's go ahead and let's get into the video.
What's up guys, in this video we're going to take a look at the crucial concepts of MTT win rates, variance and bankroll management. Now I think a lot of players tend to misunderstand all of these things, whether it be true tournament win rates, not appreciating the extent of variance, and just being completely ignorant to proper bankroll management. I think all of these things are surprisingly frequent in tournament poker, and so hopefully in this video we're going to try and set it straight, make the truth clear on all of these matters. So let's kick it off with expected win rates in numbers. Now bear with me here because there are a few figures to get through. The first and most important thing I think to remember is that when you play a tournament, you're only going to finish in the money around 20% of the time. So this means if you sit down to play a tournament, you're only going to win 1 in 5 times. And you're going to lose 4 out of 5 times. I think a lot of tournament players don't appreciate this fact. And it's important to keep in mind when you're grinding tournaments, not just to start feeling that you're very unfortunate, you're running terribly, and things like this. Next we talk about return on investment, and this is the percentage metric used to assess your profitability in tournaments. We talked about the example of this before, but just to reiterate, if you have a 10% ROI in a $10 buy-in tournament, this would mean that you're expected to make $1 profit per $10 tournament you play. And now the equation to calculate your ROI is winnings minus buy-ins divided by buy-ins times 100 to get this amount covered as a percentage. Now we have some numbers here just to convey a kind of rough idea of where you stand based on your ROI. Now it's also important to remember that ultimately these figures are irrelevant over a small sample. This is something we'll touch upon in the next slide when we talk about variance. But just now, if you have under 0% ROI, so a minus ROI, you're a losing tournament player. Break even would be 0% ROI. Now the 10% would be considered a good tournament winning player, and 20% you'd be considered an excellent tournament player, particularly or potentially even the top 1% in the field. Now, I think these figures have changed over time. Back in the so-called glory days of poker, when nobody knew anything, it was potentially possible to have ROI upwards of 80%. But now games are getting tougher, and I think a more realistic number to aim for is 20% if you really want to be doing good in the tournaments that you're playing. So this brings us to understanding variance. This is hugely misunderstood in tournament poker. The first point we talk about here is that the bigger the tournament field, the higher the variance. So this means Sunday tournaments, Saturday tournaments, particularly on PokerStars, tournaments with 1,000 plus players, they're going to have a lot of variance. And ultimately, you're going to need to run very well and experience some good luck to reach the really big money. This is primarily because MTTs have a very top-heavy payout structure, so most of the money is right at the top for the final table. A huge percentage of the prize pool, upwards of potentially 30%, is just going to be set aside for that final table, even in fields where there are thousands of players. A min cash will usually be 2 times your buy-in, maybe slightly less, and that will just be 0.00001% of the prize pool, an absolute fraction. And I think it's also important to remember that deep finishes in tournaments don't happen frequently at all. So, as we talked about in the last slide, while you're not expected to win, even make the money in tournaments often, if we define winning in a tournament as making money, you're not ever going to actually come first in the tournament, barely ever. The frequency at which you can expect to win a tournament, particularly in these very deep fields, is very infrequent. Now, I'm not here just to rain on the parade and say that you're never going to win a poker tournament, but I really want to hammer home the reality of the situation, that if you do win a poker tournament, I'm sure you've played well, but you have to keep in mind that you probably run well on top of that. Because I think it can really lead to a tough emotional existence if you feel like every time you don't come first in a tournament, you've lost. This will be emotionally very tiring if you're a tournament grinder, because the reality is that most of the time you're not going to cash and you're not going to win the tournament. The good news is that playing more volume does mitigate variance. And so if you're a tournament grinder, you're a player that has multiple tables up at once, you can battle variance over time, and in the long run, skill presides over variance. This is really important, and I'm speaking from experience here, having been an early days poker player once. I remember winning a tournament quite early into my tournament career and thinking I was the best poker player ever. Soon to realise that I definitely wasn't, and I was making lots of mistakes. And equally, you can be a very good tournament player and lose a lot. So you don't want to assess your ability on the poker table based on your performance, particularly in MTT results, just because that variance is so high. And in terms of the kind of numbers you need for an accurate sample size, anything under 1,000 tournaments is pretty irrelevant, to be honest. Variance is just so big. Unless you're playing small fields, maybe tournament fields with like 50 to 200. If you're playing anything upwards of 400 or 500 players, you're going to need a sample of more than 1,000 to get an even slightly accurate ROI. I really think from about 5,000 tournaments onwards, especially if you're playing small tournaments, is really where you can start to get a more accurate figure. Like if we just look at this graph here, so this is of a 10,000 hand sample. One of the wins here, we can see that takes the player from around 3.5 thousand to 11,000. That is a huge upswing. That's absolutely massive. And then if we see over the next sort of 3,000 hands, they then downswing quite a substantial amount. And so in these kind of small snapshots, you will notice that the variance is high and the swings can be quite big. But if we look over the bigger picture, so from the 0,000 to the 10,000 mark, we can see, and I think it's confident to say, that this player is definitely a winning tournament player. While we do have those sharp upswings and some steady downswings in parts, we can see that the overall trend of their graph over this large sample is that they're winning in tournaments. Next thing I want to talk about is mitigating variance. There's a few ways to do it, and in general, as grinders, particularly if you're relying on poker as an income, mitigating variance is a really good strategy. If you can take out luck from poker, or take out variance from poker where you can, it's definitely a good strategy to do it. So the best way to mitigate variance is to play smaller field tournaments. we discussed this a little bit. It's kind of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you're definitely pulled towards playing bigger tournaments because there are often lots of recreational players attracted to these really big tournaments with big prize pools. But ultimately, you're just raising your variance by doing so. I think adding in some of the big field tournaments as your 1 day a week of the schedule, potentially on your Sundays, is absolutely fine. But I think if you're playing these huge field tournaments all the time, the variance might be a little bit too tough for you, particularly if you're starting out. I think playing in the smaller field tournaments, getting a better sense of full structures of tournaments from the early stages right through to the late stages, getting a feel for that more frequently is a good strategy. Because if you're playing these huge events with 5,000 plus players, the reality is that you're not going to make, let's say, final tables or heads up very often. But if you're playing, I don't know, a 200-man tournament, you can make final tables a lot more frequently. And getting this experience at dealing with things like ICM and heads-up play will help you in the long run. Another way to lower variance is to play lower buy-in tournaments. You can also sell or swap action. So this is when you essentially receive funding for a portion of your buy-in. So if you're playing a $10 tournament, you could sell 50% of your action, i.e. $5. This is something that doesn't happen too often at micro stakes. You can also swap action. This is something that I would recommend doing only if the person that you're swapping with is essentially going to be a winning player. You don't want to be swapping with a player that has a negative edge in the tournament, i.e. is a losing player. But if you're friends with fellow tournament grinders and you all have edges over the field, you're expected to win in the long run, then swapping action will lower variance. Another way to avoid or mitigate variance rather is to stay away from late registration. This is because late regging, you start the tournament with a short stack, and for anyone that's familiar with short stack play, and as you'll understand later in the series, short stack play involves a lot of shoving your hand all in and getting called all in and entering these kind of flip situations where you might be a 55% favourite, might be a 45% dog, and taking these big swings is definitely a very variance heavy style of play. One other way you can mitigate variance is by choosing tournaments with a slower or deeper structures. Take this over sort of turbos or hyper turbos. This is where the structure is much faster, so you start with fewer blinds and the levels are faster, so you will reach short stacks much more frequently. Whereas deep stack tournaments commonly have slower levels to go with it. So not only will you start with more chips, more big blinds, which will generally involve a tighter strategy, but you will have more big blinds for a longer period of time. Finally, we're going to talk about bankroll management. Now, this is massively misunderstood. It's definitely a figure that varies depending on your preferences for playing tournaments. So if you play very, very large size tournaments with huge fields, you're definitely going to need a bigger bankroll than a bigger bankroll in terms of buy-ins, that is, than somebody that has experience playing tournaments at a much smaller field. I think in general I'd recommend at a bare minimum 100 buy-ins for your average buy-in. And we discussed average buy-in before. That's just the average of all of your buy-ins. If you're playing a large field event, as we've written here, I'd say 300 plus buy-ins. Definition of a large event, we'll say 2,000 plus players. And if you specialise in or prefer to play these faster tournaments, so turbos or hyper turbos, you'll definitely need more buy-ins because of this higher variance. And you might need a little bit less for playing those slow / deep stacked tournaments. So ultimately, it really does depend on what you're playing. I understand most players will probably play a mix of these things, and so I think a good thing to aim for is somewhere in the vicinity of 150 to 250 buy-ins. So just to give an example, if you're playing somewhere between $1 to $5 tournaments, you should probably have a bankroll of about $1,000. Now, this might seem like a lot for micro stakes, and if you're on a site where you're concerned about the trustworthiness of it, particularly some of the unregulated American sites, I might recommend keeping less of this money in your bankroll on the site, but essentially keeping in mind that you have money set aside should you want to top up your bankroll. Right, so that's it for this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Well, I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please subscribe by hitting that subscription link down below in the video. And also, if you guys are interested in enrolling into this full course, there's a link down below where you can enroll at a discount. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys at our next video. Take care.